I love how when St. Paul writes a letter, the whole letter kind of ties together. It's not just a random series of thoughts that St. Paul is writing down. I mean, chapter 1 is still very relevant and gives meaning to chapters 3 and chapters 4. And today's first reading is the perfect example of that. You remember that great Christian hymn that St. Paul said? I'm going to look it up here quick. Here it is. It was on Tuesday. So you had me here. Perfect. Okay. Tuesday, St. Paul in chapter 2, verse 5 to 11 gives this great Christian hymn, which is kind of maybe the focal point of the whole letter. He says things along the lines of, though he was in the form of God, okay, Jesus did not deem equality with God something to grasp. Rather, here's the key word here today's first reading. He emptied himself and taken the form of man, coming in human likeness. St. Paul describes the incarnation as a self-emptying. And remember, he says this hymn, he begins the hymn with taking on the mind of Christ, taking on the mind and attitude of Jesus, calling for himself and for the Christian, okay, not only in Philippi, but the Christian sitting here in Ashland, okay, the Ashlanders, as I call you guys. I call it Frackvillians up there in Frackville, okay, that take on the mind and attitude of Christ. What is the attitude of Christ? The attitude of Christ is a self-emptying so that he could be filled with God. Well, he is God, but for us, it's an emptying and filling in our minds, our emptiness with the dedication of faith to follow the will of God and to love God and to love our neighbors as ourselves. That Jesus in the incarnation kind of sets aside, suppresses the divine glory that is rightfully his, and embraces our humanity and lives our life like a human, including even death on a cross. And he did all this to follow the will of the Father for the salvation of our souls. And so now in contrast, as St. Paul says in chapter 2, self-emptying is the mind of Christ. What is his quote unquote beef with some of the Christians in Philippi and maybe with us today? We're not self-emptying, we're filling. So notice, their God is their stomach. They fill their stomachs. Their glory is their shame. Their minds are filled. He uses the word occupied, but we can easily use the word filled. Our minds are filled with what? Earthly things. That we have, or at least the people in Philippi have, but I think we can too, be so consumed with ourselves and with the things of this world that our lives are oriented towards, quote unquote, filling our stomachs. Maybe in America it might be better. Our lives are filled with what? Filling our pockets, filling our power, again, which we kind of are seeing right in front of our eyes right now in the current climate. Power, fame, wealth, popularity. Maybe another American thing would be pleasure. What's the next thing I'm going to do that's going to satisfy me? So there's the compare and contrast. There's the spiritual battle right there. Not just for the people in Philippi, but for the people today, for us right now, myself included. We're often distracted because we're filled in our stomachs and our minds and our hearts. We are filled with satisfying our own selves. And sometimes that comes at the expense of following God's will and following God's law. Sometimes that comes at the expense of loving our neighbor. It's a struggle that we have. So again, what's the call? The call in all this is to what? Fill and take on the mind and attitude of Christ. St. Paul ends this first reading that our citizenship is in heaven. We await our Lord Jesus Christ. He's going to change this lowly body. He's going to glorify it after the pattern of his own glorified body. And so St. Paul ends, therefore, my brothers and sisters, whom I love and long for, my crown, my joy, in this way, stand in the Lord, beloved. Okay. And that's pretty much how, I think there's going to be one more reading on Saturday, but that's kind of how the letter ends. Fill your hearts and your minds, not with the things of this world, but fill it with Christ. May God bless you.